Those angry monkeys conclude our review of the introductory quiz. Up next, we will dive into evolutionary theory and its origins. The next few slides are an overview of what this lecture is about and what you should be paying attention to. I recommend printing these if you can, or returning to them when lecture is over to help you study for the quiz. Let's start out by defining anthropology, a discipline so broad that it has been divided into 4 subfields: cultural anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and biological or physical anthropology. Anthropology is the study of humankind viewed from the perspective of all peoples and all times. In this course, we will focus on one of these 4 subfields known as biological or physical anthropology. It is the study of human biological evolution and biocultural variation. The word biocultural intends to capture the fact that humans are products of both DNA and the exterior social environments in which we live. As humans, we are made of both nature and culture. We are shaped by biology as well as the practices and beliefs of our societies. In the upper left corner of the slide, we have art produced by a Mardu artist. Mardu are first peoples of Australia who live in Australia's western deserts. Many Mardu artists have an astounding ability to conceptualize landscape features from a bird's eye perspective, without the use of a drone or aerial imagery. What do I mean? This painting is a highly accurate rendering of different types of plants and other landscape features within this person's territory, represented symbolically. We would have to be Mardu to interpret what plants and other natural resources were documented here, but an intimate connection between nature and culture emerges once one is aware of the meaning of this painting. In this class, we will study the interconnectedness of the human lineage and nature as a relationship that has developed over the course of more than 6 million years. In addition, there is a photo of paleoanthropologists unearthing the remains of one of the most recent additions to the human ancestor family, Homo naledi. Homo naledi was discovered in South Africa in 2015 and is roughly 2 million years old. This ancient hominin, dead for millions of years, may have been deliberately placed in a cave as an early ancient burial ritual. This indicates the possibility of culture. Lastly, the chimp and human hands represent primatology, the study of our closest living relatives. We share over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. Now we'll spend a moment getting to know the various types of scientists who fall under the category of biological anthropologist. Perhaps the most popular biological anthropologists are forensics experts, thanks to procedural crime dramas like Bones, which is based on the life and work of real-life forensic anthropologist Kathy Reichs. The image on the left is of the fallout at Ground Zero after the Twin Towers collapsed. Forensic anthropologists participated in the effort to identify human remains and return them to their families. In addition to working in law enforcement, forensic anthropologists do important human rights work at mass grave sites around the world, working to identify the dead and help governments and families understand the tragedies that took their lives. Anthropologists work on mass grave sites in Argentina, where an estimated 30,000 people were disappeared under a brutal military dictatorship in the 1970s. They also work with skeletal remains in Cambodia, where acts of genocide also took place during the 1970s, resulting in the death of nearly 1/4 of the Cambodian population. Primatology is the study of the behavior, biology, evolution, and taxonomy of non-human primates. Primatologists work in a variety of settings, including universities, primate research centers, laboratories, sanctuaries, and zoos. Famous primatologists include Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey. Toshisada Nishida established one of the first long-term chimpanzee field research sites in 1965 and discovered, among other things, that chimps use plants to medicate themselves when sick. Paleoanthropology is the study of human evolution through the fossil and archaeological records. It is an interdisciplinary field whose practitioners include biological anthropologists, Paleolithic archaeologists, earth scientists, and geneticists. On the left, we have Maeve Leakey, a British paleoanthropologist who studies early hominin evolution and has done extensive field research in the Turkana Basin of Kenya. Maeve is a member of the famous Leakey family, often referred to as the first family of paleoanthropology, who discovered Lucy, a human ancestor fossil rock star. Evolutionary biology is a subdiscipline of the biological sciences concerned with the origin of life and the diversification and adaptation of life forms over time. It is concerned primarily with the biological adaptations of humans to the diverse environments they inhabit. Biological anthropologists focused on evolutionary biology, for example, discovered that people with Peruvian ancestry who have inhabited the hillsides of the Andes Mountains for tens of thousands of years have a genetic adaptation to a high starch diet. Contrary to popular belief, potatoes were first grown by peoples of South America, not Ireland. In Peru, potatoes of all colors, shapes, and sizes have been developed by ingenious indigenous cultivators for millennia. Over time, a gene that helps humans break down starch and therefore make the most of a carbohydrate-rich diet like those of highland peoples has become increasingly common in these communities. For a definition of the field of osteology, I turn to the Dig It with Raven blog, a site that features helpful videos and interesting information on the field of archaeology. Dig It with Raven also has a great Instagram page for those who aspire to be the next Indiana Jones. Human osteology is a branch of anatomy that focuses on the study of the human skeleton. Osteoarchaeology, specifically, is the study of human remains from archaeological sites. The field of osteology is rather important, especially in archaeological contexts, as it allows a researcher to infer additional contextual information from the actual individuals who inhabited the site under excavation. The role of the osteologist is to identify human bones from those of non-human material, for example, animals, and to determine as much additional information as possible about the bones they are confronted with. Aside from information about age and sex, pathological or disease conditions can be inferred as well. This branch of science within osteoarchaeology is called paleopathology and concerns itself with ancient disease that may have been reflected in the skeletal body. The bone in this slide, for example, shows signs of nutrient deficiency associated with an ancient agricultural lifestyle. Now that you have a sense of who physical or biological anthropologists are and what they do, let's explore one of the key foundations of their research, evolutionary theory. Now we'll officially begin our journey into the foundations of evolutionary theory. As you've witnessed in this lecture, I am rather fanatical about people understanding and correctly utilizing evolutionary theory to think about life on Earth. On this journey, we will leave no stone unturned. But first, let's review the rock stars of physical anthropology. Can you name all of the different types of scientists we just discussed? I'll give you a minute to think of them. What unifies all of these fields of study is the use of evolutionary theory as a means of understanding biological diversity and the origins of humans, as well as the use of the scientific method to generate new knowledge. Physical anthropology is a science. The word science comes from Latin and translates to knowledge. Knowledge is developed through the collection of empirical data derived from direct observations or experiments. A systematic collection of observations forms the basis of a theory, such as the theory of evolution, or an explanation as to why a natural phenomenon takes place. This comic, depicting movie science versus actual science, pretty much says it all. Science can be boring, anticlimactic, and tedious. It is the use of the scientific method that makes science both monotonous and revelatory, as it is an organized and systematic approach to testing ideas and solving mysteries. The scientific method is surely something we are all familiar with. It's important for you to be able to name the steps of the process in the correct order. This slide is here to refresh your memory of what was probably the most boring day of your high school science class. Try not to fall asleep. Let's test your knowledge of the scientific method by taking a real-life scenario from paleoanthropology and running it through the process of setting up a research project. Here we go. Darwin proposed that bipedalism, or walking on 2 feet, emerged in apes when they left forest environments and began living in open grasslands. In other words, he proposed environmental change as the driver behind our ape ancestors standing up and abandoning their tree-dwelling lifestyles. This can be summed up in the italicized hypothesis, which is the second line of text in this slide. The next step of the scientific method is to create testable predictions. What are some predictions that would help us test this hypothesis? One might be that we would predict finding human ancestor fossils exclusively in grassland environments. Another would be that these skeletal remains would show adaptations for upright walking rather than climbing. Paleoanthropologists accepted Darwin's early hypothesis until fossil evidence found in Ethiopia shook things up. With the results of tests, or step 4 of the scientific method, in this case paleoarchaeological excavations, Darwin's hypothesis was rejected and new questions were produced. If you're still completely bored with the scientific method, consider its role in tech. I can assure you that anthropology doesn't pay, but tech does. User interface design and user experience research relies on the use of a modified version of what we just looked at, an organized and iterative process that helps tech companies to develop new products and figure out what users want. By mastering the scientific method, you could become the next Genevieve Bell, anthropologist and senior fellow at Intel. In 2012, she was inducted into the Women in Technology Hall of Fame. The first widely documented user of the scientific method was Hassan ibn al-Haytham. Note that he was doing science about 1,000 years before folks in Europe were getting systematic about their experiments. Hassan ibn al-Haytham was an Iraqi mathematician, astronomer, and physicist of the Islamic Golden Age, who proved that light bounced off of objects and was received by the eyes, rather than our eyes beaming light onto the objects around us in order to see them. Strangely enough, folks thought that eyes shot light out of them in al-Haytham's day. Now that we are all clear on the fact that light does not stream out of our eyeballs, let's take a look at the foundations of the theory of evolution. In these next few slides, we will explore the field of taxonomy, the naming system from which Homo sapiens originates. Taxonomy is a science that preceded the development of evolutionary theory and holds the origins of the field of biology. On the screen, we have a taxonomic diagram depicting the family to which humans belong, Hominoidea, the family of the apes. Taxonomy is the study of scientific classification, in particular the classification of living organisms according to their relationships, or the classification of organisms in different categories based on characteristics. Aristotle kicks off our conversation on taxonomy. He is known as the father of science and was around about 2,300 years ago. He wrote a book called The History of Animals, which was a mostly accurate account of various observations of nature, but includes a few strange errors, like the assertion that females of any species have a smaller number of teeth than the males. Aristotle developed an early classification system called the Scala Naturae. His idea was that living things could be assigned a hierarchical position on this metaphorical ladder that would represent their degree of perfection. He placed humans on the top rung and other creatures of the known world on the progressively lower rungs. Aristotle placed animals into different groups based on physical characteristics, such as animals with blood, animals without blood, animals that lived in water, animals that lived on land. During the time of Aristotle, people believed in a number of different gods, but also that gods had no interest in the mortal world. In contrast with later ideas about how life on Earth was organized that were based on the Bible, Aristotle did not believe that the universe had a creator or that nature was created for humans. Aristotle's Scala Naturae was eventually religified by biblical scholars known as scholastics. Recall that in the time of the ancient Greeks, gods were not perceived to be interested in meddling with what was going on in nature. As the Christian worldview was adopted by and or forced upon people all over what is now modern Europe, Scala Naturae, or the Great Chain of Being, became a way of seeing God's order and design in nature. A Judeo-Christian God was placed at the top, with angels and apostles immediately below him. Look closely and you'll see a unicorn toward the bottom. Clearly there were few errors in this view of animals as well. During the medieval period, which lasted from the 5th to the 15th centuries, scholars used Aristotle and the Bible. They believed that nature, including all species on Earth, reflected God's organization of life. For these budding biblical scholars, purpose and design existed within nature. Despite the fact that the Great Chain of Being hardly appears scientific, it was part of a movement that laid the foundation for the development of the natural sciences. This movement was called scholasticism and took place largely inside monasteries from 1100 to 1700. During the Renaissance period, or the 14th through the 17th centuries, this way of organizing related life forms began to fall apart. As a quick side note, the Great Chain of Being shown on the screen was actually drawn by a Tlaxcaltecan indigenous man from Mexico named Diego Valadez, who helped Spanish conquistadors to convert his people to Christianity. Colonialism and associated adventures of Europeans who traveled to places like Mexico to steal land and oppress people had a lot to do with why the Great Chain of Being needed to be rethought as a method for grouping different types of plants and animals. Carolus Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist and physician who was later knighted and became Carl von Linné. He was born in 1707 and grew up gardening with his dad. His love of botany led him to pursue science, which at the time meant becoming a physician, which only took 2 weeks. Linnaeus loved nature, and since, in his view, God had created nature, studying nature was a way to know God. Despite the fact that none of us would have been inclined to seek medical advice from him, Linnaeus's extensive travels to collect and document plant species led him to be regarded as the father of ecology, a broader discipline not yet developed in his time that focuses on relationships between living organisms. The most important aspect of Linnaeus's work for the development of evolutionary theory and later physical anthropology was the system of plant and animal classification that he developed, which helped people to understand the relatedness of living organisms and to create scientific names for all species that reflected their place in nature, or their similarities with other organisms. Notably, binomial nomenclature, or the use of a discrete combination of genus and species for each living being, is attributed to Linnaeus. In the next slide, you will come to understand Linnaeus's obsession with organizing, naming, and grouping the diversity of life on Earth. Early in his career as a botanist, he became frustrated with an awkward and inconsistent naming system for plants that became more and more difficult to use as more and more species were being discovered around the world. Here's why. Can you guess what common plant this extraordinarily long name referred to in Linnaeus's time? Here's a hint. You eat its fruit all the time, likely in the form of sauces and condiments. This was the name for a tomato. Here's Linnaeus in a fancy outfit made out of reindeer that he acquired while looking at plants in Lapland, the northernmost region of Finland, which is populated by nomadic reindeer herding peoples known as the Sami. If Santa Claus is real, he definitely lives there. In the year 1735, when Santa Claus lived in the Netherlands, he published a book called Systema Naturae. In this book, he presented a new classification for the 3 kingdoms in nature: the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the kingdom of stones. This book introduced new ways of classifying or arranging in a group both plants and animals. Linnaeus was the first person to place humans together with monkeys. As the years went by, he updated Systema Naturae, adding new species and reclassifying known ones. In the 10th edition, he moved whales from the fish category to the mammal category. Note that Linnaeus was a deeply religious man who did not believe in or even know about evolution. During his time, not many people were talking about it. Even if they were, it is unlikely that he would have appreciated the idea that a literal interpretation of the Bible was factually inaccurate when it came to understanding life on Earth. Linnaeus assumed that all species were fixed or unchanging for all time, and used similarities in their physical characteristics to put them into groups. He did not feel that organisms were related to each other in any evolutionary sense, but merely that some were more similar to each other than others. Linnaean classification includes 5 categories which are still used today: kingdom, class, order, genus, and species. Linnaeus named more than 7,000 species of plants over the course of his lifetime. The 10th edition of Systema Naturae included over 10,000 organisms, which Linnaeus believed to be a mostly complete list of every species alive on Earth. He was way off. As far as we know today, there are probably more than 8 million, and some people argue that there are a trillion. Returning to the Systema Naturae, it was picked up by scientists and gradually improved upon. By the 20th century, there were 7 categories. Family and phylum were added, and in the early 1990s, an 8th category was identified. This is the category domain, which is the most inclusive. The category domain includes 3 groups: Eukaryota, bacteria, and archaea. We and all of our animal friends are eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are complex multicellular creatures. Our cells have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, unlike bacteria or archaea. Bacteria and archaea, well, you can just forget about those until you have to take microbiology. Those domains are full of all kinds of wacky stuff like microorganisms that thrive in scalding hot water emerging from small volcano-like jets on the ocean floor. Now that we understand where taxonomy comes from, let's take a look at how it works. The American black bear is one that you have likely seen if you've been to Tahoe or Yosemite. They love human food, whether it's in a trash can, your car, or your backpack, and will stop at nothing to get their fix. Luckily, they are shy and not aggressive. They belong to the species Americanus. They share the genus Ursus with bears that you would not want to run into, such as grizzlies and polar bears, which are known to kill humans if threatened. American black bears belong to the family Ursidae that includes all of the world's bears. Black bears are placed in the same order as wolves and leopards because they are carnivores. Moving up the ranks, we see that black bears are grouped with other mammals and therefore in the class Mammalia, and the rest is fairly self-explanatory. Here's a great, very morbid way for you to remember the order of all these different categories, taught to me by my high school biology teacher, Mr. Billardello. Dumb kids play catch on freeway, get smashed. While Linnaean taxonomy emphasizes phonetic methods of classification, or similarities and differences in physical characteristics, contemporary taxonomy uses cladistics, or DNA analysis, that focuses on lineage and common ancestry. Later on in the quarter, you will learn that taxonomy gets a bit more complicated than dumb kids play catch on freeway get smashed. For example, we now have superfamilies, subfamilies, and tribes. But let's not worry about that for now. In the words of philosopher Alan Watts, don't worry about the future, don't worry about what progress you're making, just be entirely content to be aware of what is. What defines a species, the most narrow or specific group into which organisms are placed? Because so very many species of plants and animals closely resemble each other, take for example these 4 different species of vervet monkeys, it was often hard for Linnaeus and others to decide where one species ended and another began. Though imperfect, the best definition we have regarding what a species is the definition developed by John Ray. Horses and donkeys can have babies, but they are considered separate species because their offspring cannot reproduce. Neanderthals and humans are considered to be separate species, but they interbred and their offspring were clearly able to reproduce. Needless to say, it gets complicated. Something to consider: chimpanzees and humans share more than 98% of the same DNA, yet they are members of different genera. Do you think it would be possible for these two distinct but closely related species to interbreed? Ever heard of the humanzee? So what happens when new species are discovered today? The Vika provides an interesting example of the fact that science is still discovering and identifying new species. Except the Vika is not a new species. The Vika was known to people of the Solomon Islands where it lives, but no one believed them until a tree was cut down in the presence of a foreign biologist who saw the 1.5-foot-long rat fall from the tree. The Vika has strong teeth capable of chewing through mature coconuts and is an exceptionally large tropical rat. The word Vika comes from a local language in the Solomon Islands, which are near Fiji, and rather than using Latin, biologists now use native languages when naming species that are new to science. I would like to point out that there are a lot of naming systems out there. Taxonomy wasn't the first, and it isn't the only classification system around. In fact, there are probably as many forms of naming and grouping organisms as there are cultures on Earth. The Fore people, Fore, of Papua New Guinea, for example, have an in-depth and intimate knowledge of plants and animals in their homeland. They have their own names and categories for local birds, which when compared with taxonomic classification done with DNA analysis, is more than 90% accurate from the standpoint of genetics. There are many ways of knowing nature. It doesn't take a degree in biology to have a complex understanding of the relatedness of life on Earth. Let's take a moment to see if I have done an acceptable job of explaining taxonomy to you. I would like for you to use Google or your own intuition and memory to list all of the taxonomic categories to which these organisms belong. I'll give you 1 minute before revealing the answers. Hit pause if you need more time. These organisms are not only members of the same species, they are all distinguished scientists. In the back row, Dr. Katie Hunt is a paleo-oncologist who studies cancer in the ancient past. And Nigerian scientist Dr. Sheila Ochuboju Kaka is a genetic virologist. She's behind the taxonomy graphic. The development of the field of taxonomy in the 1700s revealed that life was much more diverse than imagined. New species of plants and animals were turning up as fast as they could be classified. As the 18th became the 19th century, more and more people began to wonder why and how it was that there were so many different life forms out there. This begins our discussion of the origins of evolutionary theory. Now is a good time to pause this lecture if you'd like to take a break before we begin with part 2.